Before Yale was a modern university, before American evangelicalism had an intellectual backbone, and before faith learned how to survive the age of reason, there stood one nearly blind man determined to guard the soul of a nation. Born into the shadow of Jonathan Edwards, and forged by war, revolution, and ideas that threatened to unravel the Republic, Timothy Dwight became the intellectual sentinel of New England. This is the story of the man who saved American Christianity from collapse, not with revivalism alone, but with reason, discipline, and an unyielding vision for the future. Timothy Dwight was born in 1752 in Northampton, Massachusetts, into a lineage that carried the weight of America's spiritual and intellectual history. To understand Dwight, one must first understand the shadow cast by his grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, the architect of the First Great Awakening. His mother, Mary Edwards Dwight, was more than just the daughter of a famous man. She was a brilliant scholar in her own right, who began her son's education when he was still in the cradle. From his earliest days, Timothy was viewed as the heir to a legacy of Reformed orthodoxy, a responsibility he embraced with a fervor that bordered on the ascetic. Northampton was the epicenter of a specific brand of American Calvinism. In this environment, Dwight's upbringing was steeped in the rigors of Edwardsian philosophy. This was a world defined by the absolute sovereignty of God, the inherent depravity of man, and the necessity of a disciplined, intellectual pursuit of true virtue. Dwight was a child prodigy of the highest order. Legend suggests he began reading the Bible at age 4 and had mastered the basics of Latin by the age of 6, often hiding under the covers with a candle to study when he was supposed to be asleep. This early hard study was the foundation of his greatness, but it also sowed the seeds of his greatest physical trial. By adolescence, his eyesight had begun to fail, a deterioration brought on by relentless reading and poor light. Forced to reckon early with bodily weakness, Dwight learned to discipline his mind even as his eyes dimmed, an irony that would later shape both his theology and his leadership, binding intellectual rigor to moral resolve in an age drifting towards skepticism. In 1765, at the age of 13, Dwight entered Yale College. At an age when most boys were beginning their apprenticeships, Dwight was engaging in high-level scholastic debates, mastering classical languages, and absorbing the moral philosophy that would later shape his theology. He graduated in 1769 at 17, but his academic success was purchased at a devastating physical cost. During his years at Yale, Dwight became obsessed with the pursuit of intellectual perfection, driven by a relentless fear of wasted time and unrealized potential. He adopted a regime that would have broken a grown man. He slept only a few hours a night, ate a restricted diet to avoid mental sluggishness, and read by the flickering, inconsistent light of candles for hours on end, often ignoring pain and fatigue in service of study. The result of this youthful intensity was a permanent and catastrophic degradation of his eyesight. For the remainder of his life, Dwight was functionally blind. The act of reading or writing for more than 15 minutes caused him such excruciating pain that it was virtually impossible. This disability, however, became the catalyst for his legendary mental discipline. Unable to rely on the page, Dwight turned his mind into a vast, meticulously ordered library. He learned to compose entire sermons, epic poems, and complex theological treatises entirely in his head, holding thousands of words in precise sequence until he could dictate them to an amanuensis. This cultivated mental vision allowed him to become one of the most prolific authors in American history, proving that the loss of physical sight only sharpened his spiritual insight and intellectual resolve. Following his graduation, Dwight spent 2 years as the headmaster of the Hopkins Grammar School before returning to Yale as a tutor in 1771. It was during this 6-year tenure, 1771 to 1777, that he began to leave his first major mark on American institutions. Dwight looked at the traditional Yale curriculum, which was heavily focused on rote memorization of ancient logic and Hebrew, and found it woefully inadequate for a young nation on the verge of birth. He perceived a dangerous stagnation in the colonial classroom, fearing that if the American intellect remained shackled to dusty medieval syllogisms, the revolution of the mind would fail before the revolution of the state could even begin. He believed that a leader should not only be a scholar of the past, but a master of modern eloquence. Alongside fellow tutors such as John Trumbull and Joel Barlow, Dwight introduced the study of polite letters, modern English literature, rhetoric, and poetry. This group of young intellectuals became known as the Connecticut Wits or Hartford Wits. They represented the first true American school of literary criticism. Beyond mere aesthetics, they viewed refined language as a political tool, a means to unify a disparate public through shared narrative and dignified discourse. Dwight's 1771 address, a dissertation on the history, eloquence, and poetry of the Bible, served as their manifesto. He argued that the American mind required a voice that was as sophisticated as the European elite, but remained anchored in the moral soil of New England. He sought to create an American epic, a task he attempted with his poem The Conquest of Canaan, an allegorical work that fused biblical history with the rising tide of American patriotism. By drawing parallels between the Israelites and the American colonists, Dwight provided a spiritual and intellectual framework for American exceptionalism. This period was marked by an intense desire to prove that the New World could produce a culture as refined as the Old World's, but with a superior moral core. A conviction that transformed Yale from a provincial seminary into a vibrant laboratory for the American identity. When the American Revolution broke out, Dwight did not hesitate to put his principles into practice. In 1777, he joined the Continental Army as a chaplain at West Point. This was a pivotal moment in his development. It was here that his theological training met the harsh realities of war. Dwight was not a chaplain who stayed safely behind the lines. He was known for his strict punctuality and his ability to command the respect of both the rank-and-file soldiers and the officer class, including General George Washington. Dwight's wartime sermons were masterworks of civic religion. He didn't just preach about the state of the soul, he preached about the state of the nation. He understood that for the revolution to succeed, it needed more than just gunpowder. It needed a moral foundation. He composed patriotic songs that were sung around campfires, blending the struggle for independence with the biblical narrative of a chosen people seeking a promised land. His service was cut short in October 1778 by the death of his father. As the eldest son, the duty of supporting his mother and 12 siblings fell squarely on his shoulders. He resigned his commission and returned to Northampton, trading the chaplain's gown for the farmer's plow. For 5 years, he worked the soil, taught school, and even served in the Massachusetts legislature, gaining a practical understanding of governance that would later serve him as a university president. This period of manual labor and local leadership served as a secondary education in the American character. While his hands were calloused by the plow, his mind remained fixed on the burgeoning national identity. He saw no contradiction between the sanctity of the soil and the rigor of the classroom. This season of domestic sacrifice refined his temperament, transforming a fiery orator into a seasoned polymath. By the time he moved to Greenfield Hill in 1783, he had mastered the art of balancing celestial aspirations with earthly responsibilities. There, he established a renowned academy, proving that a robust, moral education was the surest defense against the infidelity he feared was creeping into the post-war American heart. These diverse experiences, from the trenches of West Point to the halls of the legislature, laid the essential groundwork for his eventual ascent to the presidency of Yale. In 1783, Timothy Dwight returned to the ministry full-time, becoming the pastor of the Congregational Church at Greenfield Hill, Connecticut. These 12 years were perhaps the most intellectually formative of his career. As he looked out from his pulpit, Dwight saw a new and dangerous enemy emerging: French atheistic ideas. The radical skepticism of the Enlightenment, championed by figures like Voltaire and Rousseau, was beginning to permeate the American consciousness. To Dwight, this was a threat far greater than the British crown. He believed that without a foundation of Christian virtue, the new republic would collapse into the same chaotic violence seen in the French Revolution. He responded not with emotionalism, but with sober, logical argumentation. He sought further theological training from his uncle, Jonathan Edwards Jr., and began refining a style of preaching that was less about abstract metaphysical speculation and more about the utility of truth. This transition marked his emergence as a public intellectual. At Greenfield Hill, he also founded a co-educational academy that gained national renown, proving his theory that rigorous education must be wedded to moral instruction. He viewed his students as the future guardians of the American experiment, tasked with resisting the infidel philosophies gaining ground in urban centers. His dual role as pastor and pedagogue allowed him to sharpen the rhetorical tools he would soon use to transform Yale's campus. He believed that religion was not just a private matter of the heart, but the essential framework for a stable and free society. By 1795, Dwight had established himself as the premier defender of Reformed orthodoxy in New England, and his reputation as an administrator and educator made him the inevitable choice for the presidency of Yale College. When Timothy Dwight was elected the 8th president of Yale College in 1795, he inherited an institution on the brink of intellectual and moral collapse. The spirit of the French Revolution had crossed the Atlantic, and the student body was enamored with infidel philosophy. Deism, the belief in a distant, non-intervening creator, was the fashion of the day. Students at Yale were reportedly calling each other by the names of famous deists like Voltaire and Rousseau, and traditional religious observance was viewed with open mockery. The chapel was empty, and the moral conduct of the students was in sharp decline. Dwight did not respond with administrative crackdowns or expulsion. Instead, he stepped into the college pulpit and challenged the students to an intellectual duel. Recognizing that the youth valued independent thought above all else, he launched an aggressive preaching campaign, inviting the students to bring their best arguments against Christianity to him in open debate. He did not fear their logic. He believed their logic was flawed and incomplete. With a brilliant mind and a fatherly persistence, he systematically dismantled their skepticism using the very tools of reason they claimed to champion. Dwight's lectures didn't just win arguments, they captured hearts. This culminated in a series of powerful revivals within the college, beginning in 1802. The transformation was seismic, turning cynical skeptics into passionate leaders of reform. Dwight provided the intellectual framework that allowed the Second Great Awakening to take hold in the educated classes. He made Christianity intellectually respectable again in an age of reason, transforming the campus from a hotbed of skepticism into a bastion of evangelical zeal that would eventually influence the moral fabric of the entire nation. As an administrator, Dwight was the prototype of the modern university president. He understood that a college could not survive on theology alone. He modernized Yale's curriculum by establishing the first professorships in chemistry and natural history, famously hiring the young Benjamin Silliman and sending him to Europe for training. Dwight understood that the scientific revolution was not an enemy of faith, but a means of uncovering the intricate design of the Creator. He oversaw the founding of the Yale Medical School and was a driving force behind the creation of Andover Theological Seminary. Dwight's vision was of a total education, one where science, literature, and theology were not enemies but partners. He revolutionized student life by replacing the rigid, adversarial relationship between faculty and pupils with a system of mentorship based on mutual respect. He professionalized the faculty, expanded the library, and improved the physical campus, believing that an environment of excellence would foster a culture of virtue. By emphasizing rigorous debate and oratorical skill, he prepared a generation of leaders to navigate the political complexities of the young republic. He also encouraged coeducational schooling and expanded the university's influence into the public sphere, believing that education was the primary tool for social stability. Under his leadership, Yale became the premier institution of American learning, drawing students from across the newly formed states. His theological contributions during this time were solidified in his Theology, explained and defended in a series of sermons. Unlike his grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, who focused on the sovereignty of God in a way that sometimes made human effort seem irrelevant, Dwight emphasized the utility of human activity. He taught that while salvation was a gift of grace, The means of grace, study, prayer, and moral living were essential duties. He was suspicious of the unbounded reason of the consistent Calvinists, the New Divinity movement, and instead elevated practical reason. He repeated his cycle of 173 doctrinal sermons every 4 years, ensuring that every student who passed through Yale would receive a complete education in Reformed orthodoxy. This systematic approach ensured a consistency of thought among the New England clergy for an entire generation. His sermons were not merely religious lectures, they were defensive walls built against the rising tide of Unitarianism. By grounding his logic in common-sense realism, Dwight bridged the gap between strict dogma and the intellectual demands of the Enlightenment. He argued that the Christian life was a rigorous pursuit of benevolence, where faith was validated by its tangible fruits in society. This theological shift, focusing on moral agency and the use of means, became known as the New Haven theology. It provided the intellectual fuel for the Second Great Awakening, empowering a new class of revivalists to call for immediate repentance and social reform, ultimately dominating American evangelical thought for decades. Politically, Dwight was a staunch Federalist and a leader of the Standing Order in Connecticut. He viewed the rise of Jeffersonian democracy with deep suspicion, fearing that it would lead to the same secular chaos he saw in revolutionary France. His opponents mocked him as the Pope of Federalism, a title he wore with a certain degree of stoicism. He believed that a stable society required a foundation of religious virtue, and he fought tirelessly against the disestablishment of the state church. This commitment to a structured society extended into his literary life. As one of the Hartford wits, he utilized poetry and satire to champion American cultural independence while upholding traditional moral standards. He believed that national greatness was inextricably linked to intellectual rigor and communal piety. Beyond politics, Dwight was a prolific institutional founder. He helped establish several missionary and Bible societies, including the American Bible Society and the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. He saw Yale as a light to the nations, a training ground from which evangelical leaders would go out to reform the social and moral fabric of the world. His students, including figures like Lyman Beecher, would go on to lead the great social reforms of the mid-19th century, from temperance and education reform to the nascent abolitionist movements. Dwight's vision of a Christian America was one of active engagement, where the church and the university worked together to improve the human condition. This legacy transformed Yale from a local college into a national powerhouse of moral and social influence. Despite his failing health and the heavy burdens of the presidency, Dwight remained a man of letters. In his later years, he undertook extensive travels through New England and New York, often on horseback to find relief from his physical ailments. These journeys resulted in his 4-volume Travels in New England and New York. In these pages, he acted as a geographer, historian, and sociologist, recording the details of the American landscape and the character of its people. He wrote with the explicit goal of vivifying the past and refuting foreign critics who claimed that American culture was crude and unrefined. He provided a detailed, loving account of New England life, portraying it as a model of ordered, virtuous civilization. He documented the growth of towns, the development of agriculture, and the moral habits of the citizenry. He remained dedicated to this project until the very end, working on the manuscript within days of his death on January 11, 1817. His travels remains one of the most important primary sources for understanding the social and intellectual landscape of the early American Republic. Timothy Dwight died as he had lived, as a sentinel watching over the intellectual and spiritual soul of New England. He left behind a Yale that was the premier institution of American learning and a theological legacy that bridged the gap between the Puritan past and the burgeoning scientific and democratic future of the United States. He was a polymath who saw no conflict between the laboratory and the pulpit, a leader who believed that the mind and the soul must be cultivated together if a nation was to truly prosper. His life stands as a testament to the power of integrated leadership, proving that one could be a traditionalist and a revolutionary at the same time. He left an enduring mark on American higher education, evangelical theology, and literary culture, that persists to this day. He was the bridge between the colonial mind and the modern American intellect. Timothy Dwight believed that nations rise or fall not merely by armies or laws, but by the ideas they teach their children. His life reminds us that faith and intellect need not be enemies, and that education shapes destiny. If you found this exploration of American church history valuable, consider subscribing to the channel. New episodes examine the people, movements, and ideas that shaped Christianity and the modern world. Like the video, share it with others who care about history and theology, and subscribe to continue this journey through the minds that built the Christian tradition.